بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وأنذرهم يوم الحسرة إذ قضي الأمر وهم في غفلة وهم لا يؤمنون إنا نحن نرث الأرض ومن عليها وإلينا يرجعون واذكر في الكتاب إبراهيم إنه كان صديقا نبيا إذ قال لأبيه يا أبت لم تعبد ما لا يسمع ولا يبصر ولا يغني عنك شيئا يا أبت إني قد جاءني من العلم ما لم يأتك فاتبعني أهدك صراطا سويا يا أبت لا تعبد الشيطان إن الشيطان كان للرحمن عصيا يا أبت إني أخاف أن يمسك عذاب من الرحمن فتكون للشيطان وليا قال أراغب أنت عن آلهتي يا إبراهيم لئن لم تنته لأرجمنك وهجرني مليا قال سلام عليك سأستغفر لك ربي إنه كان بي حفيا وأعتزلكم وما تدعون من دون الله وأدعو ربي عسى ألا أكون بدعاء ربي شقيا فلما اعتزلهم وما يعبدون من دون الله وهبنا له إسحاق ويعقوب وكلا جعلنا نبيا ووهبنا لهم من رحمتنا وجعلنا لهم لسان صدق عليا واذكر في الكتاب موسى إنه كان مخلصا وكان رسولا نبيا صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Dr. Zuhair Ismail studied accounting and finance at the LSE before qualifying as a chartered accountant. Thereafter, he began pursuing full-time studies in the Islamic seminaries of Syria and London before moving to Qom, where he has spent the last decade studying and teaching. He was awarded a doctorate in philosophy from the University of Exeter with a thesis title of Between Philosophy and Irfan, Interpreting Mullah Sadra from the Qajars to Post-Revolutionary Iran. Please can we welcome him with a loud salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين صلاة على محمد وآل محمد صل على محمد. Alhamdulillah, we begin by thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for gathering us here today for the very special occasion for the remembrance of Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam, because there are so many people that pass by this life and this world and they do not have the opportunity to remember Abu Abdullah al-Hussein because of their distance from him, his distance from not knowing him, not growing up hearing about him, and perhaps hearing about what he went through on the periphery. Just like we hear about other great personalities, we hear about them just on the periphery, and we don't have a chance and an opportunity to try and develop our understanding and our connection with any of those personalities. But here we find ourselves year upon year with the barakah that comes with the majalis and the remembrance of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, and that is something that we first and foremost have to be extremely thankful for. Even in all corners of the world, Shia cannot always find a majlis to go to, and it's beautiful that year upon year we're able to commemorate these events. The topic for my discussion for the next few nights follows on quite neatly from the discussions that Dr. Ali Raza Bojani was speaking about in the last few nights. What he was talking about is a kind of critical examination or a kind of critical attitude that we should have as it pertains to our deen, in order that we don't distance ourselves from our deen doesn't become irrelevant to us, and so on and so forth. And similarly, the issue of the historical events and what happened leading up to the day of Ashura and the day of Ashura itself is a case study within the Shi'i milieu and within Shi'i scholarship of this kind of examination and re-examination of sometimes what we consider to be given truths. Generally speaking, when it comes to Islamic scholarship, we don't have given truths that will always stand forever. We have truths that have tested the test of time, but those truths have been discussed by fallible people. And because they've been discussed by fallible people, they are always open for re-examination, including things like historical sources. Now, in the beginning, when you think of a historical source, say for example you have a book in which an event has been recorded, you might think to yourself, well, how can you re-examine something that's been recorded? At the end of the day, somebody, had some certain sources in front of them and recorded down what they understood, or what had been transmitted to them. But we can examine sources in the light of each other. So sometimes you can have a source in one book, it is explained in a certain way. And you can have a source which is from another book and it is explained in a slightly different way. And so you can compare these sources to see which event or which version of the event seems to be closer to the truth. Beyond that as well, there is a grading in historical sources. Sometimes some historical sources are early, some historical sources are later. So generally speaking, you would prefer earlier historical sources to later historical sources, but maybe not. It would depend on the reasons for why you would prefer one text over another. So there are many concerns, many things to think about. And this is basically what defines a search for history. History is an effort in which we try and refine our understanding of what actually occurred. Yes, we might do that through accounts of people that then come after, but what we really want to know is, can we know what happened? And that separates stories or, let's say, events like the event of Karbala from perhaps a myth, like the myth of King Arthur. Okay, the myth of King Arthur is something we cannot really know the reality about. But the events of Ashura, the events that happened in the lives of our Holy Prophet ﷺ, while there have been some academics that have gone as far as to call it myth, it is perhaps a bit extreme to go to that side and call, the historical sources that we have just myth. So we'll look at this in a little more detail, especially as it pertains to the events of Karbala, and discuss this in relation to memory. Okay, now, the reason why I've separated history and memory for this discussion is that while the way events are remembered forms a part of history, sometimes memory itself can take on its own development. Memory is how we remember an event. Okay, so if, for example, we had an event in this mosque, we were all present in this mosque, we would remember it in a certain way and we would narrate it in a certain way. Okay? But imagine there were gaps in what we said. Right? There were gaps in the expressions on people's faces, for example, or the emotions that people were going through. There would then, perhaps as that story was passed down, there would be a motive for people to try and guess and put themselves in our shoes and think about how we would have felt. Okay? And that is how memory develops. As you can see, of course, I'm going to bring this in line with the whole history of Karbala, and how we have a history which is a search for the events, and we have a history which is to do with memory. And memory itself is a kind of art form. And how these two have traditionally been seen to be at loggerheads, but how we can perhaps have a more nuanced discussion and bring these two together. And as it pertains to the events of Ashura, why should we search for a history? That's a question that we should perhaps ask ourselves. Is it the case that we need to search for history? Do we need to know what happened? Isn't it enough for us to know generally that certain things, if you like, historical truths occurred, and that is enough, and then move on from there and concentrate on emotion rather than to concentrate on history? And I think there is an argument for that. If you look at our early encouragement of having majalis, you'll find that the early majalis were primarily to do with poetry, not to do with the narration of events. And that is why, when we'll come and look at some of the historical sources and the slight problems that we have as it pertains to the history of Ashura, we'll see that we lack a lot of information. And if history had been that important, then we shouldn't have lacked all of that information. Rather, what we find from the Ahlul Bayt is an encouragement to hold ceremonies of mourning, primarily to mourn over the event, to create an emotional connection with the event. That is the primary thing. What is encouraged is crying, making other people cry, and then if you can't cry, to try and make yourself cry. Those are the things that are encouraged. Of course, visiting Imam Hussein alayhi salam, again, is another way to build that emotional connection. So perhaps even in our discussion of history and memory, we can bring in this aspect as well, that when we are kind of balancing the two, should we find a place for memory, even if sometimes it is not absolutely historically accurate? It is sometimes an imagination of events rather than the, if you like, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Now, again, why should we then, so if memory is what is encouraged, why should we bother with history? What is the purpose in us bothering with history if, like I said to you right now and argued, that it is memory that's important, it's the emotional connection that is important? Well, I honestly think that comes back to us. In the modern period, we want to know the truth. We want to know what happened. We find it difficult to connect to imagery if it is not connected to something underneath that. And that is a result of the modern era that we live in. We live in a scientific era, we live in a modern era, and we want to know why. We want to know how to connect. But it's not only that. I think that the process of history is a process of building the self. It is a process of developing the self. Because when a person delves into history and delves into the events of Karbala, they are forced to put themselves in those positions and to truly understand what happened in those times is to truly connect back to our own humanity, is to put ourselves in those shoes and to empathize. That is how we create a connection. When we can see the story, when we can live through the events, pass through the various stages that the Imam passed through, and that is facilitated by history. When we look at history and we follow the Imam in his shoes as a pinnacle of humanity, we learn to truly admire him. Many people ask, how are we supposed to connect to Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam? One of the ways to connect to him is to truly admire him, to truly take him as a source of inspiration, to truly see him as a goal. I would like to be a human being like Imam Hussein was a human being. I would like to be the way he was in the trials and the tribulations that he was in. I'd like to follow his way. In fact, if we take a look at the companions were so enraptured by the personality of Imam Hussein that their lives were for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And the process of history helps us in a way to connect to that personality through examining our own, through putting ourselves in those shoes and really getting to the point where we would have been there. We would have been of the companions of Imam Hussein. We would have fought alongside him because we give him that respect and that position really and authentically within our personalities. And then the emotional connection is easy because the events that occur even in the most historical, reductive manner are tragic. There's no doubt about that. There's no issue at all about how tragic these events are, and especially to a personality of the like of Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, this discussion of how we remember Imam Hussein alayhi salam and what the history of what occurred in Karbala is something that has been discussed amongst the ulama. And the reason for this discussion is that there were a lot of stories that were expressed from the various pulpits. And what some of the ulama found was that these stories take away from the greatness of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wasalam. Because sometimes when we try and elevate them to a superhuman status, we end up almost shooting ourselves in the foot. We detach them completely from what it means to be a human being. So what they found is that there were many stories circulating, many imaginations circulating that didn't have a basis in history. And one of the first people to tackle this problem was Muhsin al-Amin. So from the kind of impetus that was given by Muhsin al-Amin, we then had a series of writings that were written. The first one, I'm just trying to remember the name. Yes, okay. Muhaddis Hussein al-Nuri, he wrote a book, Al-Lu'lu' wal-Marjan. And in this book, he argued quite seriously for a reformation as it pertained to the narrations pertaining to what happened to Imam al-Hussein and his family. His argument was as follows: lying against the Holy Prophet and his family is a sin. It is absolutely forbidden. Okay? Any event that is not attested to by history constitutes as a lie. Okay? If it doesn't have a basis in history, it is just an imagination, it is a lie. Okay? You can see this argument is quite strong. He says any other justification that is given, so if we justify by saying, well, it's important to make people cry, or it's important to maintain a connection, or any other reason that we give for a recommendation for not telling, if you like, the purely historical version of events, those are all mustahab. Those are all recommended. When you have recommendation and you have something that's forbidden, well, it's very clear which side is going to take precedence. So as you can see here, he's arguing very strongly for a purely historical version of events. And his arguments were then continued and followed on, and the next kind of book that we see, or collection of speeches that we see, is a collection produced by Ayatollah Mutahhari, which is translated in English, Ashura, Misrepresentations and Distortions. What we see in Ayatollah Mutahhari's work is, again, he is trying to put some boundaries on the issue of memory. He doesn't argue like this, but he tries to sift out any narrations that are unbelievable, any narrations that don't occur in early sources. Sorry, any narrations that don't occur in sources. But he doesn't stress on early sources, just things that don't occur in sources. And that is why even Ashura, Misrepresentations and Distortions, he brings an event that occurs in a later book. Okay, he brings an event that only first appears in Bihar al-Anwar. And as we will see, in the ulama moved on from this level as well. So there was a time where, as long as it was in a book of history, it was okay to think that that was what happened, or to recite that version of events. But as time has moved on, the next book that comes is a book written by Ray Shahri, Muhammad Ray Shahri, which is a large encyclopedia called Mawsu'a al-Imam al-Hussein fi al-Kitab wa Sunnah wa Tarikh. This is one volume of it. It's an 8-volume work. In this book, Ayatollah Ray Shahri, he tries to gather the earlier sources. Okay, so he then classifies the sources to, if you like, sources between the 2nd and 3rd century, and then sources that come later on in the various centuries, and says that we should basically concentrate on the earlier centuries and focus on those rather than the later ones. But even he goes only to this extent. So he has created an encyclopedia that has all of the versions, all of the various versions, but doesn't go to the extent of now picking between them, choosing or trying to refine the most plausible version, or plausible versions. Because as we'll find with history has versions. It doesn't just have one version. Because you have many narrations, what we do is we put a probability on each version. This is a probable, if you like, version of events. Another one is more probable, another one is less probable. And so that finally brings me to a book written by a scholar called Ja'far al-Muhajir, and he has written a book, Karbala ilaykum al-Haqiqa, which means Karbala, this is the truth. Okay? In that book, he concentrates heavily on the narration of events from Abu Mikhnaf. And Ray Shahri, as he comes to discuss Abu Mikhnaf, classifies Abu Mikhnaf as one of the sources we can't rely on. So there's a discussion there as well in terms of that. I know I've taken up probably more than the normal time for the lecture, So I'll start with that inshallah next time. Inshallah, but if there are any questions, inshallah.
But
Allah.
so we have some time for questions. If there are any questions from either side?
So you said that anything which is in imagination is a lie. So at that very moment when you were saying, I was thinking that our whole faith, lot of component of faith is an imagination.
Yeah, thank you. See, I said his argument was quite strong, and perhaps you might not agree with that premise as well. An imagination might not necessarily be a lie, right? An imagination is, if you like, a hypothesis. A hypothesis is not a lie. It is only if you say the imagination is the truth, that's where you have a problem. And this here is where memory and history conflict. Because many times when we go for majalis, we don't think we're listening to memory. We think we're listening to history. Right? So if you think you're listening to history and you're listening more to a kind of derived idea of what things may have been like, then that is where the conflict arises. Okay? Or if there are events that are not attested to by the earlier sources but attested to by the later sources, that's not necessarily a lie. That is something that is attested in a later book. So his line of argument was quite strong, and not everybody takes that line of argument as well, but it was a line of argument that was there. As for our deen being mainly imagination, I also wouldn't go that far either. I mean, if our deen was just imagination, we would be in a serious problem. As you remember, I don't know if you were here for Sheikh Ali Raza's lectures as well, but he gave a very good discussion on the role of the intellect in the creation of the Islamic intellectual tradition. And we have tried to stay away from imagination as much as possible. And like I said to you, there's always a process of refinement as well. So we're always refining thought within scholarly circles. But sometimes that is missed generally because, like I said, we think everything in Islam is sorted and solved. Islamic studies is a world of discovery and a place where every person who enters that field has the ability to contribute to it. So, inshallah, our deen is not based on imagination, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Zuhair. Unfortunately, I have forgotten the name of the author, but he takes even more radical line, if you like, when he says that you look at the events of Karbala as a pure event without any miraculous foresights or happenings. Straightforward, Imam was invited by a large number of followers. He went there and he got trapped. This idea that he had the premonition, he'll be killed there and all that, we don't need it. I'm sure you would know, is it Ardabelli something?
I also, the name has escaped me, but I've seen
I don't know, his name escapes me. It had created quite a stir in Iran and then above. So I think that's beyond even history. It's not only, no emotion, but even beyond history. It's like more reasoning, if you like.
No, that's thank you for that comment as well. Sometimes what is said about history is that it's secular, okay, and that at the same time makes it more accessible. But I think even when it comes to the premonitions and things like that, we do have a basis to not deny them, if that makes sense. We have enough traditions which would be considered historical enough, if you like to put it like that. But yeah, one of the things I want to show as well is that in the very human understanding of what happened to Imam Hussein, that is one of the things that we can connect to. And that doesn't have to be taken to a superhuman level. In fact, taking it to a superhuman level can sometimes be destructive. But here is a very careful balance of, if you like, secularizing the whole thing and becoming detached from it, and at the same time emotionally connecting to it and understanding what happened as a process of development rather than as a process of distance. Because that critical engagement shouldn't end in distance and disengagement and it not mattering.
Thank you for the lecture. When you speak about history and imagination, isn't there space for both? Because it is important to get our historical facts right. But imagination, what the brother said, in its connection to faith, imagination also allows us to perhaps understand the feelings of all these actors. And if we cannot connect through our feelings, then historical accounts on its own will not be enough. And Karbala would be lost to us. And there are so many lessons that revolutions and, fights for justice Karbala is so potent for that. And if we take imagination out of that, then perhaps we will be at a loss. So my question is, surely there is room for both.
Absolutely. And what I wanted to show as well is that the process of history involves imagination. There's no historian who can give you a picture of what happened without imagining it. Yeah? They have to put the facts together using their imagination. So imagination is part of history, and that is how the memory develops. Memory develops through a use of the imagination, like you say, to emotionally connect to the things that happened. Like I said, the problem here is when we think memory is history and history is memory. In order to understand both of them and not put them into conflict is to put each of them in their place, right? To understand history as history and memory as memory. And like I said as well, there is an argument to say memory is more important.
Why can't multiple memories constitute a history? Surely there's multiple viewpoints, the victors versus the victorious, or those who have lost the battle. And all those memories are important in order for us to understand. So why can't multiple memories constitute a history? Why does it have to be one and not the other?
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, because memory itself, I didn't define its boundaries. Memory is a lot wider than what happened. Okay? Memory now includes stories of how it would have been. So I'll give you a small example to help the discussion a bit. From history, it is very hard for us to know about the small children about Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. Because generally small or young children are not important enough for historians or not important enough for people witnessing events to pay attention to them. Okay? But we know they existed. Okay, we're certain enough that there were a number of small children who, were unknown to us. Okay. And we also can be fairly certain that many of them suffered through the movement of the caravan from Kufa to Sham. In fact, we are, as a historian, you would be quite certain a number of them died, that they went through a lot of suffering, and so on and so forth. We find that a version of a small child of Imam Hussein appears in later discussions, much, much later than the earlier sources and what happened to her in Sham. Okay? Now, how do we reconcile between that and the fact that the earlier sources don't have this information? Is because, if you like, that gap needed to be filled. Or there are many other examples of this where there's not enough information in the earlier sources and then the gap needs to be filled. For example, a certain personality who is extremely important in the camp of the Ahlul Bayt. For example, an early source says, and he died, without any story. And the reason it's like that is because the person who is narrating the event is just too far. He just, if you like, it's too far for him to see what happened. He just knows that at this point, this is what happened. So memory then comes in to kind of fill that gap. And then sometimes it gets included in sources. So like you say, they can. So then beyond that, you have memory that has no relation to books whatsoever. Events that absolutely we just don't know. Did they happen? Did they not happen? Okay? Now, if you classify those things as memory, yeah, if you classify those happenings as the way we imagine it would have happened, or the way people have imagined it would have happened, okay, then we can tolerate them. Okay, otherwise you will just say it was not there. And there are a number of events that are just, sometimes they're just not there in any book, even later works, all the way until very well-known kind of problematic works. So that's why I say sometimes memory is in conflict with history. Yes, there is what I hopefully will somehow show as well is that the nexus where history and memory come together is in the very process of history. Yeah, like how you use imagination in getting a proper understanding of what happened. It is also in mistakes in history, because sometimes a single mistake can cause a memory, right? And that sometimes is done by the early historians themselves. They have made the mistake. Why? Because they have not been able to imagine the event the way it was. Yeah, so they've made a mistake in the way they've recorded. So that's why I say sometimes there's a conflict between history and memory, and how can we tolerate and how can we kind of bring together these things. It comes from a deeper understanding of the process itself, yeah, and a deeper understanding of why it's important, or why it would be tolerated, yeah, as opposed to just maybe classifying it as a lie and just kind of putting it out of the window. Yeah. I don't know if that was a very long answer to your question, but hopefully there was an answer in there somewhere. Yeah.
And maybe you can pick up after at the end of the program, if that's okay,
sure.
directly. If that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. If it's okay.
Is Salah time?
We'll end there, and then we'll do some. I think we've got about 15-20 minutes before. All right now.
Is this for Masai? Okay.
So.
Well, 2 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Since the event of Ashura, the happenings have been crystallized in poetry. And early poetry focuses on the sadness of what happened, as well as the feeling of regret, because there were many people that regretted that they couldn't participate. There were many people that regretted that they had participated. And I want to read for you a few lines of poetry. The first line is narrated from Imam As-Sujjad alayhi afdalus salatu wassalam. As he entered the city of Kufa, he said these lines addressing the people there. He said, "So do not be happy, O people of Kufa, by what afflicted Hussein. What afflicted Hussein was great. The one that was killed on the banks of the river, may my life be sacrificed for him. Those who killed him, their recompense is hell. فلا تفرحوا يا أهل كوفان بالذي أصاب حسينا كان ذلك أعظما قتيل بشط نهري روحي فداء جزاء الذي أراده نار جهنم. But more heartbreaking was the poetry that was recited by Kulthum alayha Abdullah salatu wassalam when she also entered the city of Kufa. She said these lines of poetry. She said, "You have killed my brother Sabran." Sabran means while he was in a state of resistance. فَوَيْلٌ لِأُمِّكُمْ. So woe be on your mothers. You will be recompensed with the heat of the fire. You have spilt a blood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made forbidden to be spilt. And the Quran has forbidden it. And then Muhammad. She says, so have the tidings of hell tomorrow, and in its hole, in the hole of the fire where its heat is rising. As for me, I will cry in my life upon my brother, upon the best one after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, who was born, with tears that are flowing, but at the same time appearing while being held back. So the kind of tears that are being held back so profusely, but because of their insistence in coming out, because of their plethora, they appear on the eyes. They will fall on my cheeks, melting and not becoming dry, not becoming firm. So because of the heat of the emotion, the tears will melt rather than become dry. قتلتم أخي صبر فويل لأمكم ستجزون نارا حرها يتوقد سفكتم دماء حرم الله سفكها وحرمها القرآن ثم محمد ألا فابشروا بالنار إنكم غدا لفي قعر نار حرها يتصعد وإني لأبكي في حياتي على أخي على خير من بعد النبي سيولد بدم غريز مستهل مكفكف على خد مني ذائب ليس يجمد على لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
صلوات. That's Hussein. That's Hussein. That's Hussein, son of Haydar. We send us salams. Send us salams. Nabi Allah's grandson. We send us salams. Send us salams. A man on his mission to save Allah's word. Confrontation from tyrants that wanted the world. Refusing the bayat from cursed Yazid. Ya Imam, Ya Hussein, Ya Mazlum, Ya Shaheed. That Hussein, that Hussein, that Hussein, son of Haydar, we send us salams, send us salams. Nabi Allah's grandson, we send us salams, send us salams. Alone by the Euphrates, calling for aid. His brothers were martyred, their bodies lay slain. With Asr approaching, the time had arrived. His sword now unsheathed, the lion unleashed. That Hussein, that Hussein, that Hussein, son of Haydar, we send us salams, send us salams. Nabi Allah's grandson, we send us salams, send us salams. His Khaybar, the spear from Ali Akbar's chest, the three-pronged arrow from Asgar's small neck. For no man should witness their children's demise. But alas, my Imam, oh what choice did you have? That Hussein, that Hussein, that Hussein, son of Haydar, we send us salams, send us salams. Nabi Allah's grandson, we send us salams, send us salams. In battle this hero triumphed over all, but Asr was here, as was Allah's call. Their stones, spears and arrows, as he forced from Zuljanah, straight into sajda, the value of Salah. That Hussein, that Hussein, that Hussein, son of Haydar, we send us salams, send us salams. Nabi Allah's grandson, we send us salams, send us salams. His body lay headless, trampled by hooves, the ultimate insult that Yazid approved. The widows are screaming, the tents are on fire, whilst enemies plunder the loot they desire. That Hussein, that Hussein, that Hussein, son of Haydar, we send us salams, send us salams. Nabi Allah's grandson, we send us salams, send us salams. A man on his mission to save Allah's word. Confrontation from tyrants that wanted the world. Refusing allegiance from cursed Yazid. Ya Imam, Ya Hussein, Ya Mazlum, Ya Shaheed. Salawat.
Now we will start the Maqtal and Marshia. We hope that the delivery of the most poignant aspects of Imam Hussein's journey through a series of conversations will help our audience better relate to and encourage further observations of this pivotal episode in our history. Great effort has been made to keep true to authentic sources such as Sheikh Mufid, as well as tapping into different forms of observations across the Shi'i world. We are always open to suggestions and comments that help us on our collective journey towards fulfilling our duties towards Allah.
Day 5. When morning came, Imam Hussein stopped to offer the dawn prayer. He then rushed to mount his horse and leave with his followers in an effort to split away from Hur and his companions. Hur intercepted them and continued to press them towards Kufa. However, Imam Hussein opposed Hur's attempts to divert them there, and they continued their journey until they reached a place called Nainawa. Suddenly there appeared a rider on faster mount, bearing weapons and carrying a bow on his shoulder, coming from Kufa. They all stopped and watched him as he read out the letter, which told her to halt Hussein in an open area with no protection or water. Hur began to implement the order by forcing people to halt at a place with no access to water and cut off from any village. Imam Hussein asked her if they could stop at Nainawa. Hur replied that they could not allow Imam to go to the village as the spy was watching over him. Zuhair ibn Qayn pleaded with the Imam to fight against Hur before reinforcements are sent. Not for the first time, the Imam said that he will not be the one to initiate the fighting. It was the 2nd of Muharram, 61 years after Hijrah. They made their way to the village of Akkar in the district of Karbala and stopped there. The arrival of the army of Ibn Sa'ad. Ibn Ziyad gave instructions to the governor of Ray in Iran, Omar ibn Sa'ad, to advance towards the army of Hussein. Omar ibn Sa'ad responded,
If you can relieve me of this mission, then do so.
Ibn Ziyad said he would only do so if he hands back the governorship of Ray. Omar did not wish to relinquish the governorship because of the power it held. However, he was conflicted and sought advice from his close friends. Everyone advised him not to undertake this mission. His nephew, Hamza ibn Maghira, came to meet him and pleaded with him.
O uncle, I implore you, in the name of Allah, to desist from moving against Hussein, for it will constitute a great sin in the eyes of Allah and violates the bond of kingship. By Allah, it would be better to give up all your worldly wealth and your governorship than to meet Allah burdened with responsibility of having spilled Hussein's blood.
Umar ibn Sa'd agreed to follow the advice and went to Ibn Ziyad and told him of his decision. He said that he would not be the best candidate to fight on his behalf, and Ibn Ziyad responded,
It's simple. Either you set out against Hussein with your soldiers, or hand over your governorship.
Nothing of the insistence of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, he agreed to undertake the mission with 4,000 soldiers. They arrived in Nainawa the next day, on the 3rd of Muharram. After sending a messenger to meet with Imam Hussein, Umar ibn Sa'd sent a letter to Ibn Ziyad stating that the Imam is now prepared to go back now the people of Kufa have changed their minds. Ibn Ziyad was upset at the letter and replied,
In the name of Allah, the Compassionate, the Merciful, I have received your letter. Offer Hussein and his followers the opportunity to pledge allegiance to Yazid bin Muawiyah. If they do not, prevent Hussein from reaching the water supply. They should not be allowed to taste a single drop, just as was done to the righteous, pious, and oppressed Caliph Uthman bin Affan.
Umar ibn Sa'd dispatched Umar ibn Hajjaj with 500 horsemen to be stationed along the river in order to prevent Hussein and his followers from obtaining water. The water embargo was in place 3 days before the battle against Hussein. Ibn Sa'd met with Imam Hussein. And following this meeting from Ibn Sa'd sent a second letter to Ibn Ziyad stating that Hussein had agreed to go in self-appointed exile or go to Yazid to offer his pledge of allegiance to him and resolve their differences.
With this offer, you have the consent you wanted, and the community gains benefit.
When Ibn Sa'd's letter was read out, Shimr ibn Dijoshan rose up and said,
By Allah, if you allow him to leave your dominion without obtaining his allegiance, he will be considered strong and powerful, and you will be viewed as weak and impotent. As you have the upper hand, there is no need to compromise. Let Hussein submit to your judgment. Then if you punish them, it will be because you are the person most appropriate to punish. And if you forgive them, you have the right to do so. By Allah, I have been told that Hussein and Umar ibn Sa'd sit between the military camps, talking all night long.
Ibn Ziyad was impressed with the advice from Shimr and replied to him,
Yes, your judgment is wise and astute. I am sending you to Umar ibn Sa'd to ask him to ensure that there is no more delay. If they continue to refuse to submit to my authority and surrender, then kill them, for they are deserving of death if they rebel. If Hussein is killed, let the horses trample back and forth on his chest, for he is a treacherous rebel who has divided the community. Tell Ibn Sa'd that if he helps execute our order, then we will give him a reward befitting those who listen and obey. If he refuses, then seize him, sever his head and dispatch it to me here. Then you take command and complete the mission.
When Shimr arrived in Nainawa, he relayed Ibn Ziyad's message. Omar was angry at Shimr for interfering with his plans and he told Shimr,
May Allah deprive you of His mercy. It is you who has influenced Ibn Ziyad against accepting my proposal, and so have spoiled our efforts for a peaceful solution. Hussein will never submit, for he is endowed with a proud spirit like his father's.
Tell me what you plan to do,
asked Shimr.
Will you execute the governor's order and battle with his enemy? If not, withdraw and hand over the command of the army to me.
No, you will not benefit by exploiting this situation,
announced Umar ibn Sa'd.
I will execute the order and you will lead the men.
Shimr approached the camp of Imam Hussein and called out for Abbas, Ja'far, Abdullah and Uthman, the sons of Imam Ali and al-Banin. They were his nephews, and so he offered them a guarantee of safety and security. Abbas was angered by this and retorted,
May Allah curse you and your guarantee. What sort of an uncle are you who offers us security while the son of the Messenger of Allah has no guarantee of safety? We are in no need of your promise of safety, for the guarantee of Allah is better than that of an immoral person.
Salawat.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله وصل اللهم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن عليا